Granddaughter wouldn't let go of my hand at her mother's birthday dinner. That's the detail I keep coming back to. Not the silence at the table. Not the way my son-in-law kept refilling his own glass without offering anyone else. Not even the way my daughter laughed a little too loudly at things that weren't funny. It was the way 7-year-old Lily gripped my fingers under the tablecloth and wouldn't let go, even when she needed both hands to cut her food. She just held on. "She's tired," my daughter Renee said when I mentioned it later in the kitchen, lowering her voice and glancing toward the living room where her husband Trevor was watching football. "She's been having trouble sleeping." I'd driven 4 hours from Knoxville to Nashville for Renee's 35th birthday. It should have been a celebration, but the house felt wrong in a way I couldn't articulate, the kind of wrong you feel in your chest before your brain catches up. I'm a retired school counselor, 31 years working with kids in Tennessee public schools. I know how children behave when something is off. I've sat across from hundreds of them, watched the way they hold their bodies, listened to what they say and what they don't say. So when I noticed Lily over the course of that evening, the flinching when Trevor raised his voice to cheer at a touchdown, the way she positioned herself always with her back to a wall, the careful stillness she maintained whenever he was in the room, I felt that old familiar tightening in my gut. Something was wrong with my granddaughter. After dinner, I found her in the backyard sitting on the bottom step of the deck, poking at the grass with a stick. The October air was cool and the light was fading. I sat down beside her. "Hey, Ladybug, what are you thinking about out here?" She shrugged without looking up. "Your mom says you haven't been sleeping well." Another shrug. I'd been a counselor long enough to know not to push, so I just sat there with her for a while, the two of us watching the sky go orange and pink above the tree line. After a few minutes, she leaned her head against my arm. "Grandpa?" "Yeah, baby." "Do you think a room can remember things?" I kept my voice very steady. "What do you mean? Like if something happens in a room a lot?" She paused. "Does the room know?" My heart was hammering. "What room are you thinking about, Lily?" She was quiet for so long I thought she'd decided not to answer. "The garage," she finally said. "Very quietly," she finally said. "Very quietly. I don't like the garage." Renee called us in before I could ask anything more. The rest of the evening I watched and said nothing, which is one of the hardest things I've ever done in my life. Trevor made a joke at dinner that made Lily shrink into her chair. Renee didn't seem to notice, or maybe she'd gotten so used to noticing that she'd learned to unsee it. I know that happens. I've watched it happen in families my whole career. I drove back to Knoxville that Sunday night with Lily's questions cycling through my head the entire 4 hours. Does the room know? Monday morning I called my old colleague Beverly, who'd spent 20 years as a forensic interviewer for the Department of Children's Services before she retired. We met for coffee. I told her what Lily had said, the way she'd behaved at dinner, all of it. Beverly set down her cup. "How long has this been going on?" "I don't know. I noticed something was different at Christmas, but I told myself I was imagining it. She's 7. I thought maybe it was just a phase." "Has she ever said anything directly?" "Not directly, but Brian. She always called me by my name when she was about to say something I needed to hear clearly." "You didn't imagine it." "I knew I hadn't. But when it's your own family, you want to be wrong." Renee had married Trevor Holt 5 years ago. He was a project manager for a commercial construction company, good salary, coached youth soccer on weekends, the kind of man who made a strong first impression and maintained it carefully. My late wife had liked him. I'd had reservations I couldn't fully justify. Something about the way he controlled the pace of every conversation, the way Renee deferred to him on everything, even things that had nothing to do with him. But I'd told myself that wasn't my business, that Renee was an adult, that I had no right to impose. I'd been wrong about that too. That week I drove back to Nashville, but I didn't call ahead. I knew Trevor worked long hours and that Renee volunteered at Lily's school on Tuesday mornings. If I timed it right, Lily would be at school and the house would be empty. I've turned that decision over in my mind 100 times. Was it legal? Not entirely. Was it right? I'm still not completely sure. What I know is that I sat in my car outside their house on a Tuesday morning in late October, watching Renee's Subaru back out of the driveway at 7:45, and I thought about Lily's face at that dinner table. And then I got out of the car. Trevor had shown me where they kept a spare key years ago, attached magnetically to the inside of the mailbox. He'd been proud of the hiding spot, actually. Said it was clever. The house was immaculate. That particular kind of immaculate that feels less like tidiness and more like control. Everything precisely placed. No dishes in the sink. No shoes left by the door. The kind of house where a child learns quickly to make herself invisible. The garage was accessed through a door off the kitchen. It was locked, not the normal push-button lock on the handle, but a separate deadbolt keyed on a door that led to the attached garage. An interior door, dead-bolted. I stood there for a moment, just looking at it. In 25 years of visiting that family, I had never once been in their garage. Every time I'd asked, casually, just making conversation, Trevor had redirected. Storage, a mess, nothing interesting out there. The key wasn't hard to find once I started looking. Trevor was methodical and organized. A man like that puts keys somewhere logical. I found it in the drawer of his home office desk, in a small labeled envelope, the way people label things when they live alone inside their own system. The label just said G. My hands weren't steady going down those 2 steps into the garage. The garage held one car, Trevor's truck, and along the back wall, an area that had been curtained off with heavy blackout curtains hung on a rod. I pushed them aside. There was a folding table. On the table, a laptop closed, a small tripod, a ring light, the kind content creators use, folded and leaning against the wall. And on a low shelf, labeled storage bins, organized, dated. The oldest bin was labeled with a date from 2.5 years ago. Lily had just turned 5. I don't have the words for what I felt standing there. I've worked with traumatized children for 3 decades. I've sat in rooms with parents while investigators explained what had been done to their kids. I thought that experience had prepared me to face this kind of evidence with something approaching clinical steadiness. It hadn't. I took photographs. Every surface, every angle, the curtain setup, the tripod, the ring light, the labeled bins. I didn't open the bins. I couldn't. Whatever was in them, I knew I couldn't trust myself to stay functional if I looked at it directly. I photographed the labels and the dates and I got out. I sat in my car in their driveway for about 2 minutes before I started driving. I didn't have a plan. My body just drove, and my body took me to the Nashville Metropolitan Police Department's North Precinct on Dickerson Pike because that was the closest one. I asked to speak to someone in crimes against children. A desk officer looked at my face and picked up her phone. The detective who came out to meet me was a man named Walsh, probably in his early 50s, broad-shouldered, unhurried, in the way of someone who has learned that urgency can spook people into silence. He took me to a small room with a table and 2 chairs and a box of tissues on the counter, and he let me talk. I talked for a long time. When I showed him the photographs on my phone, he didn't react the way I expected. He just nodded slowly, like each image was confirming something he'd already suspected. Then he put down the phone and looked at me directly. "Sir, I need to be honest with you. The way you obtained this, entering the home without permission, that's a problem for us. It could be a problem for the case. I know. A defense attorney will use it. I know that too." I looked at him. "But my granddaughter is in that house. Whatever you need from me, I'll give it. I just need you to believe me." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I believe you." He left me in that room for what felt like an hour. When he came back, he had another detective with him, a younger woman named Pryor, and a representative from the DCS Child Protective Unit. They asked me to go through everything again from the beginning. Lily's behavior at dinner, what she'd said about the garage, what I'd found, the dates on the bins. Detective Walsh said they'd need a warrant. He said it could take until that evening. He asked me not to call Renee. That last part was the hardest thing I've ever agreed to. I checked into a Hampton Inn on Briley Parkway because I couldn't drive back to Knoxville and I couldn't go anywhere near that house and I couldn't sit still. I watched 3 hours of cable news I didn't absorb and ate a granola bar from the vending machine and kept my phone in my hand. At 7:14 p.m., Detective Walsh called me. "We executed the warrant this afternoon," he said. "Trevor Holt has been taken into custody. Your daughter and granddaughter are safe." I pressed my hand over my mouth and didn't say anything for a moment. "Lily?" I finally managed. "She's with your daughter at Vanderbilt Children's right now. She's being examined by our forensic team. There's a victim advocate with them." He paused. "Mr. Alderman, the evidence in that garage was significant. I don't remember the drive to Vanderbilt. I remember the parking garage. I remember the elevator. I remember a hospital corridor that smelled like every hospital I'd ever been in. Renee was in a small waiting room off the pediatric wing. She was sitting in a chair with her knees pulled up to her chest, which is exactly how she used to sit when she was 9 years old and scared. When she saw me come through the door, she made a sound I hope I never hear again from one of my children. This raw, broken sound, the sound of someone who has been holding something catastrophic together with their bare hands and has finally run out of strength. I crossed the room and held her. "Dad," she kept saying. "Just that, Dad." She'd known something was wrong. She told me that later, much later, that she'd felt the shape of it for months but hadn't been able to see it clearly. That Trevor had been so careful, so controlled, that she'd begun to doubt her own perceptions. He told her that her anxiety was making her paranoid, that Lily was a sensitive child who needed structure, that her instincts were wrong. That's what abusers do. Beverly had explained it to me years ago in a professional context. They don't just control the victim. They distort the people around the victim until everyone is confused about what's real. The DCS caseworker, a woman named Cheryl, came to speak with us around 9 that evening. Lily was going to be admitted overnight for the examination and evaluation. She'd been calm with the forensic interviewer, Cheryl said. Remarkably calm for a child her age, which can sometimes indicate a child who has learned to compartmentalize. She'd answered questions clearly. She'd confirmed what had been happening and for how long. 2.5 years. I've sat with that number every day since, and I still can't hold the full weight of it. Cheryl was careful with Renee, patient. She explained what would happen next, the investigation, the charges, the child welfare process, the therapy. She explained that Renee was not being investigated, that the evidence indicated she had no knowledge or involvement, but that there would be a safety assessment for the household. Renee asked if Lily could come home. Cheryl said yes. I went back the next morning. Lily came out of her hospital room in a yellow sweatshirt she'd gotten from somewhere and found me sitting in the waiting room. She stopped when she saw me. "Grandpa, hey Ladybug." She crossed the room and climbed into the chair next to mine and leaned against me the same way she had on that deck in October. After a moment she said, "Is he gone?" "Yes, baby." "Is he coming back?" "No, he's not." She nodded. Then she was quiet for a while. Then she said, "The room doesn't have to remember anymore." I didn't trust my voice to answer. I just pulled her closer. The weeks that followed were the hardest of my life in a particular way. Not because things were falling apart, but because falling apart was the process of getting somewhere better, and you can't always tell the difference from the inside. Renee took a leave from her job at the marketing firm. I drove down most weekends and stayed in the guest room. We found a therapist for Lily, a woman who specialized in trauma and worked out of a calm, yellow-painted office in Brentwood, with 2 goldfish on her desk and a collection of sand trays that Lily eventually told me she liked because you can make whatever you want and nothing is wrong. That detail does something to me every time I repeat it. Lily had nightmares. Some nights were very bad. She'd wake up and Renee would sit with her, or I would if I was there, and we learned not to rush the calming down, just to be present and steady, to let her lead. Her therapist, Dr. Tudier Morrow, had given us specific language to use, specific ways of responding that didn't inadvertently reinforce the fear. I had 30 years of professional knowledge, and I still needed the coaching. Trevor's case moved through the system over the following year. His attorney attempted to have the evidence suppressed on the grounds of my illegal entry, and there were several months where that motion hung over everything like a storm system. In the end, the judge ruled that law enforcement's subsequent warrant had been obtained independently and that the evidence stood. His attorney then pivoted to attacking the forensic interview of Lily, arguing coaching, suggesting contamination. Child trauma experts testified about the methodology, about why what Lily had said had all the markers of genuine disclosure. Lily did not have to testify. In Tennessee, there are provisions to protect child victims from direct cross-examination in certain circumstances, and the prosecution successfully argued for alternative testimony. I will be grateful for that for the rest of my life. Trevor Holt was convicted on 4 counts of aggravated child sexual abuse and 2 counts of production of child sexual abuse material. The judge at sentencing called the documentation he'd kept organized, dated, deliberate evidence of a predator who understood exactly what he was doing and chose to do it anyway. She sentenced him to 40 years. With Tennessee's mandatory minimum provisions, he would serve at least 34. His family predictably fractured. His mother sent Renee a letter that was so cold and so focused on her own suffering that Renee couldn't finish reading it. I read the rest so Renee didn't have to, and then I threw it away. My relationship with Renee changed in ways I'm still understanding. There was a period in those first months when she was angry with me. Not about anything I'd done, I think, but because I was there and the anger had to go somewhere, and she trusted me enough to let it land on me. I tried to hold that without defending myself because Beverly had warned me it might happen and because Renee deserved to be angry at something she didn't have to be careful around. We got through it. We're still getting through it. Lily is 10 now. She plays soccer and she's obsessed with marine biology, and last summer she delivered a presentation at her day camp about bioluminescent sea creatures that her counselor filmed on a phone and sent to Renee with 3 heart emojis. She has a best friend named Joelle who sleeps over almost every Friday. She laughs at things that are actually funny, and sometimes at things that aren't funny, and sometimes she laughs at absolutely nothing, and it's the best sound I know. She still sees Dr. Morrow once a month. She says she likes going. It's good to have a place where you can say anything, she told me once. I thought about 31 years in school counseling, about all the children who'd sat across from me in my office, and I thought, yes, Lily, it really is. There is something I need to say directly, because I've thought about it for 3 years and I think it matters. I almost didn't act on what I saw at that birthday dinner. I sat in my car after I left Nashville that first Sunday night, and I had a long, ugly internal argument with myself about whether I was seeing things that weren't there, whether I was projecting, whether I had any right to interfere in my adult daughter's marriage, whether I should wait and watch longer and gather more certainty before doing anything that couldn't be undone. That argument lasted most of 4 hours on the highway, and it is entirely possible that I could have talked myself out of acting. That would have been the easier choice. I love my daughter. I didn't want to blow up her life. I didn't want to be wrong. I didn't want the weight of what it would mean if I was right. But Lily asked me if a room could remember things. A 7-year-old child asked me that, sitting on a back step in the October dark, and something in her voice told me she needed someone to finally pay attention, and I was the someone who was there. Here is what 3 decades of working with kids taught me, and what the past 3 years have driven into the bedrock of who I am. Children don't invent the specific things they invent. They might misremember sequences, might use imprecise language, might not have the vocabulary for what they've experienced. But when a child communicates distress about a specific person, a specific place, in specific terms, that is not imagination. That is a child finding the only language available to them to describe a real thing. Trust it. I know that trusting it is terrifying. I know that it can mean upending the lives of people you love. I know that you might be wrong, and I know that being wrong would be awful. And I also know what being right and staying silent costs. I know that cost in years. I know it in Lily's nightmares and Renee's empty months and a birthday dinner where a little girl held my hand under the table and would not let go. If you are in my position, if you see something, if a child says something, if your gut tells you something, please act. Call the Child Help National Child Abuse Hotline at 182-422-4433. Call your local Child Protective Services. Call your local Child Protective Services. Call law enforcement. Tell a mandatory reporter. Tell someone who can do something. You don't need perfect proof. You need enough concern to make the call and let the people trained for this do their jobs. Lily asked me once when she was 8 whether I was glad I'd gone to their house that Tuesday morning. I told her the truth. I said it was the scariest thing I'd ever done and that I'd go back and do it again without hesitating. She thought about that for a moment. "I'm glad you didn't look away, Grandpa," she said. I keep that sentence in the same place I keep everything that matters most to me. On the days when I second-guess myself, and there are still those days when I wonder if I missed signs earlier, when I count the months backward and feel sick, I take it out and hold it. I didn't look away. That's what I had. That's what I gave her. It turned out to be enough. I think about that Tuesday morning more than I talk about it. The way my hands weren't steady on the steering wheel driving to that house. The way I sat in the car for a few extra minutes after I parked, not because I was uncertain, but because some part of me understood that walking up that driveway meant crossing a line I couldn't uncross, that whatever I found or didn't find, I was going to have to live inside the consequences of that choice for the rest of my life. What I've come to understand is that consequences work in both directions. We talk about them mostly as punishment, as the bad thing that follows the wrong thing. But consequences are also what follow the right thing. Trevor's choices produced consequences that stretched across years and touched everyone in that house. My choice to act produced consequences too: a warrant, an arrest, a child who eventually learned to sleep through the night again. Every action moves forward in time and lands somewhere. That's not fate. That's just how cause and effect works in a human life, and we choose every single day which direction we send things. I spent 31 years as a school counselor telling kids that who they became had a lot to do with what they decided to do when things got hard. I believed that when I said it. I believe it more now. Because what I've learned from Lily's story, from watching her go from that silent, watchful child on the back step to a 10-year-old who gives presentations about bioluminescent sea creatures, is that recovery isn't passive. It requires people who know right from wrong and choose right even when it costs them something. It requires the intelligence to read a situation clearly instead of reading it the way you want it to be. And it requires the kind of endurance that doesn't look dramatic from the outside. It looks like driving 4 hours every weekend, sitting in waiting rooms, learning new language from a trauma therapist, showing up even when showing up is the hardest thing. Renee had to do all of that. She had to look at her own marriage clearly after years of being told her perceptions were wrong. And that takes a particular kind of moral courage that I don't think gets talked about enough. The courage to stop protecting yourself from a truth that's going to hurt you. She did it anyway. She chose her daughter, and Lily. I watch Lily now and I see something that can't be manufactured or given to a child from the outside. She knows, at 10 years old, that she told a hard truth and the right thing happened because of it. She knows that speaking up, even when she was terrified, changed the direction of her life. That kind of knowledge becomes something structural inside a person. It becomes the thing they stand on when the next hard moment comes. Beverly told me once that the children who come through trauma with the most resilience are almost always the ones who had at least one adult who saw them clearly and refused to look away. Just one is enough. It doesn't take a village in that moment. It takes one person willing to believe what a child is telling them and do something about it. I was that person for Lily, the same way my own father had been that person for me, at a different kind of crossroads years ago. We pass it forward, or we don't. That's the only choice that matters. She told me she's glad I didn't look away. I'm glad I didn't either.